The Salem witch trials, or the murder of people deemed witches throughout history, is used to condemn Christianity as an ideology, despite these actions being completely separate from the Christian doctrine. Witch and wizard are used in the Old Testament differently. What we would consider a witch today in the Bible is equivalent to a wizard, while witch is categorized different. Regardless whether one believes in conjuring of spirits or not, we would all agree that these wizards have no place in a healthy society. Back in the biblical days, death was the only viable punishment or viable option, as prison was not a viable or safe option for the populations around. The Old Testament was harsher regarding the consequences due to this. The Old Testament was a guide for the purpose of the survival of the Israelite lineage, bring forth a bloodline and its surviving associated religion, for which God would build upon to reach all of humanity through all nations. However, in the time of multiple horrendous human and child sacrifices, violent rituals, and promotion of perversions embraced by these tribes, a wizard is an individual who worship their gods in a brutal and satanic way, invoking spirits through the death of organisms for the intention of inflicting harm on others, in many cases for money. Case in point, when we look around the tribes of the world today currently, we see this practice of the Bible's description of wizards, like witch doctors, which is a satanic, sadistic practice of invoking spiritual evil through the destruction of the living. This has no place in a healthy society, and it was not allowed to exist in the early Jewish society either, due to this inevitable corruption of a healthy society. Today we have police to halt these illegal practices in societies. Back then, they didn't have police, nor the resources to sustain such lawbreakers to such a degree of prisons. These wizards' practices ultimately led to the worship of other gods and other unsafe practices. This led to such evil practices as child and human sacrifices, which the Bible clearly associates with the wizard and the explanation for condemning it among the Israelite populations. Anyone who is honest in their conclusions when they assess the history of the barbaric actions associated with early polytheistic practices. A witch, however, is separated into its own category, yet clumped in with the deceitful practices. Paul in the New Testament, a scholar of the Old, uses the word witchcraft. The Greek word used in this context for this practice is pharmakia, which means medication. Unlike the physicians who used medication positively, witchcraft is associated with negative intentions associated with pharmacology. Given the understanding of Paul and the Greek word he uses for witchcraft, as well as the context in which the word witch is used in the Old Testament, it's obvious to conclude that a witch was unlike a wizard in the sense that a witch was a sort of herbalist with negative intentions, or our modern drug dealer equivalent. Someone benefiting from the sorrows of others based on their ability to make and sell pharmaceuticals for the purposes of addiction and destruction. Today we lock up such people like drug dealers. Back then, it was not a viable solution, as prisons were not viable in the sense that it put the population in harm's way. It was much more practical and realistic to just execute the person in question. We have adopted the Greek word witchcraft into our modern medicine practices with pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical comes from the word pharmakia, which is used in the Bible to describe witchcraft. In conclusion, in the era of no law and order enforcement, it was put upon the people to enforce the laws, to ensure the productive society ultimately and the survival of the Jewish lineage and religion, which due to these laws has become the oldest remaining documented society. While these societies that practice things like sorcery, utilizing wizards and witchcraft, ultimately contributed to their destruction in every single case. So though witch hunts have caused much unnecessary and biased death, it has been taken out of context to be used as a form of control, rather than a form of worship to the Christian God. It's also important to note, Paul says, such people will not enter heaven, rather than calling for their death despite the Jewish law, because Paul understood that Jesus brought choice to the Jews and to the Gentiles, consequences to your soul rather than to your flesh, as the lineage and religion had fulfilled its purpose in survival, and the new laws were required to build the nations of the earth that we have today. So when people use Salem witch trials as a way to condemn Christianity, it shows how little they actually understand about the Bible, Jesus, or the necessary purpose of the laws in that era. in a time where the death penalty was the only way to uphold productive standards in a productive society. And those laws have proved themselves, as it is the only sustainable surviving ancient society that remains. Those that followed the laws dictated to the Israelites survived when others didn't, and these are the laws they followed.